there is a boundary where the safety of solid ground ends and the suffocating black waters of the unknown begin. Welcome back to Scary Hours of Darkness. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. We spend a lot of time on this channel exploring the deep, ancient woods, the lonely mountain trails, and the abandoned architecture of forgotten towns. But tonight, we are wading into an entirely different kind of nightmare. Tonight, we are venturing into a claustrophobic, aquatic hellscape. We are hunting through the humid, stagnant rot of 2025's most harrowing search and rescue logs, where experienced, hardened teams vanished into the sawgrass or returned forever changed by what they witnessed. We are going to examine the rhythmic, deliberate tapping against aluminum boat hulls in the dead of night. We are going to look into those inexplicable, massive bipedal wakes trailing skiffs through midnight peak. These accounts expose the suffocating, terrifying isolation that occurs when the marsh stops being just an environment and begins breathing back. What makes these stories so deeply unsettling is the source. These aren't campfire tales from lost hikers. These are the official, deeply buried accounts of search and rescue professionals, men and women who know these wetlands better than anyone. They are the first responders we rely on, which makes their sheer terror all the more visceral and grounded. As you listen, imagine the heat. Imagine the smell of sulfur and decaying vegetation. Imagine being surrounded by black water that hides unimaginable horrors just beneath the surface. Before we sever our ties to the civilized world and drift off the map, please make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment in the shadows below to let me know which of these encounters chilled you to the bone. So, pull your blankets close, lock your doors, and prepare to get wet. Here are 4 terrifying swamp encounters reported by search and rescue teams in the year 2025. Now, let's get into tonight's stories. Story 1, submitted by Adam Lindsay. My name is Adam Lindsay. I have been a search and rescue specialist operating out of southern Louisiana for over 15 years. I grew up on the Bayou. I know the sounds of the swamp at midnight like I know the sound of my own heartbeat. I know how a bull alligator sounds when it slides off a muddy bank. I know the screech of a barn owl, and I know the eerie, almost human wail of a bobcat in the distance. Because of my experience, I was usually the one they called when someone went missing deep in the labyrinth of waterways where the airboats can't reach, and you have to rely on a small aluminum skiff and a push-pull. But after the events of June 14th, 2025, I turned in my badge. I sold my boat. I moved to a high-rise apartment in the city, and I refused to go anywhere near stagnant water. You have to understand, what happened out there broke something fundamentally logical inside of my brain. It started as a routine call. A young couple, Mark and Jenny Lawson, had rented a shallow draft boat to take amateur wildlife photography. They were supposed to be back by sundown on June 13th, 2025. By midnight, when they hadn't returned, the local sheriff's department initiated a search. I was dispatched the next evening as the sun was beginning its slow, bloody descent behind the weeping willows and Spanish moss. The heat that day was oppressive. It was a kind of humid, stagnant rot that makes it feel like you're breathing through a wet, dirty wool blanket. I was working alone in my motorized skiff, navigating a particularly dense, unmapped sector of the basin, known locally as the Devil's Pocket. The water here is black as pitch, heavily stained by the tannins of decaying cypress leaves. As night fell completely, the swamp came alive with the deafening roar of cicadas and tree frogs. I had my heavy-duty spotlight sweeping the dark water, illuminating the glowing red eyes of gators scattered along the banks, waiting for an easy meal. Around 11:30 that night, the radio crackled. It was dispatch, asking for a status update. I keyed the mic, told them I was entering the northern perimeter of the Devil's Pocket and had seen no sign of the Lawson's boat. As I released the button, my outboard motor sputtered, coughed out a thick cloud of gray exhaust, and died entirely. Silence instantly rushed in, to fill the void left by the engine. It was a suffocating, heavy silence, broken only by the natural, nocturnal symphony of the marsh. I cursed under my breath, grabbing my flashlight and moving to the stern to check the fuel lines and the prop. Sometimes the thick, fibrous weeds get tangled in the propeller and choke it out. I leaned over the back of the aluminum skiff, shining my light down into the murky, impenetrable water. The prop was clear. The fuel line was connected. The engine had just inexplicably failed. I sat back down on the metal bench seat, wiping the sweat from my forehead. I decided I would give the engine a few minutes to cool down before trying to pull start it again. I turned off my spotlight to save battery, leaving only the dim glow of the moon filtering through the dense canopy above. That is when the tapping started. Clink, clink, clink. It was a sharp, metallic sound reverberating through the thin aluminum hull of my skiff. It sounded like it was coming from directly beneath my feet. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. In my 15 years on the water, I had bumped into submerged logs, I had turtles scrape against the bottom of the boat, and I had gators aggressively tail slap the sides. But this was different. This wasn't a random collision or an animal thrashing. This was rhythmic. It was deliberate. Clink, clink, clink. It sounded exactly like Knuckles Boney, hard knuckles, rapping against the underside of the boat, asking for permission to come inside. I slowly, very slowly, reached down and picked up my heavy steel flashlight. I gripped it like a club. The tapping stopped for a moment. The swamp around me seemed to have gone dead silent. The frogs had stopped croaking. The insects had stopped buzzing. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, the tapping moved. It started at the bow of the boat. Tap, tap, tap. Then, it slowly traveled along the port side of the hull, right below the waterline, moving toward the stern where I was sitting. Tap, tap, tap. I could hear the water sloshing ever so slightly as something of immense size moved just beneath the surface, tracing the perimeter of my skiff. My heart was hammering against my ribs, so hard I thought it might shatter them. I clicked on my flashlight and aimed the beam over the side into the black water. Nothing. Just the floating particulate of the swamp. Suddenly, a violent, bone-jarring thud struck the bottom of the skiff, dead center. The force of it lifted the boat several inches out of the water. I was thrown to the floorboards, dropping my flashlight. It rolled under the seat, casting chaotic beams of light into the humid air. I scrambled backward, grabbing the wooden handle of my push-pole. I stood up, my knees shaking, aiming the pole at the water like a spear. "Who's there?" I screamed, my voice cracking, sounding thin and pathetic in the massive darkness of the bayou. "Search and rescue! Identify yourself!" The water beside my boat began to bubble. Large, viscous bubbles rose to the surface, popping with a foul, sulfurous stench that smelled like rotting meat and ancient mud. Then, slowly, something broke the surface. It was a hand, but it was not human. It was excessively long, pale and bloated, with skin that looked like it had been submerged for a century. It had 6 digits, each ending in a thick, blackened, jagged nail that resembled a broken piece of flint. The hand reached up and gripped the gunwale of my aluminum boat. I could hear the metal groaning and warping under the immense, impossible pressure of its grip. I didn't think. Instinct took over. I raised the heavy wooden push-pole and brought it down with every ounce of strength I had, smashing it directly onto those pale, bloated knuckles. A sound erupted from beneath the water that I will never, ever forget. It wasn't an animal's cry. It was a guttural, wet, vibrating hum that vibrated the very fillings in my teeth. It sounded like a massive set of vocal cords, forcing air through lungs filled with swamp muck. The hand violently retracted into the black water, rocking the boat dangerously to one side. I threw down the pole, scrambled to the outboard motor, and pulled the starter cord with the desperation of a dying man. By some miracle, the engine roared to life on the first pull. I threw into gear and slammed the throttle wide open. The skiff shot forward, tearing through the duckweed and lily pads. I didn't look back. I navigated entirely by memory and the dim moonlight, driving recklessly until I burst out of the Devil's Pocket and into the main channel. I never found Mark and Jenny Lawson. No one did. Their rental boat was discovered a week later, on June 21st, 2025, perfectly intact, anchored in the deepest part of the Devil's Pocket. There were no signs of a struggle. But the search team that found it noted something deeply disturbing in their official report. The entire underside of their aluminum boat was covered in deep, jagged scratches and dozens of small, circular dents. It looked exactly as if something had been violently tapping on the hull from the bottom, trying to get in. I know what they heard in their final moments. I know the rhythm of that terror. And I know that whatever is down there in the dark, stagnant rot, it is still waiting. Story 2, submitted by Sarah Reeves. My name is Sarah Reeves. I pilot airboats and skiffs for a specialized search and rescue unit covering the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Florida Everglades. If you have never been out in the glades at night, you cannot truly comprehend the sheer scale of the darkness. It is an ocean of sawgrass, extending for thousands of square miles. A river of grass where the water is only a few feet deep, but the mud beneath it can swallow a tractor whole. Out there, you are completely at the mercy of the elements, and you quickly learn that humanity is not at the top of the food chain. My encounter occurred on August 2nd, 2025. It was the peak of the wet season. The humidity was sitting at a suffocating 100%, and the air was thick with clouds of mosquitoes so dense you had to wear a mesh net just to draw a breath. We received a call about a missing local, an eccentric old man named Silas Davis. Silas was a known poacher and a hermit who lived in a ramshackle stilt house deep in a restricted quadrant of the Everglades. He knew the marsh better than the back of his hand, so for him to miss his weekly supply run to town meant something had gone horribly wrong. I was deployed at dusk, operating a flat-bottomed aluminum skiff equipped with a quiet mud motor. Airboats are too loud for a stealthy search, and they can easily damage the delicate ecosystem in the restricted zones. I was running a grid pattern through a maze of tight mangrove tunnels and vast open patches of sawgrass. By 1 in the morning, the exhaustion was setting in. The rhythmic hum of the mud motor and the endless, repetitive landscape of reeds and black water was having a hypnotic, numbing effect on my brain. I was navigating a wide, straight channel that cut through a particularly dense field of 10-foot-tall sawgrass. The moon was nearly full, casting long, sharp shadows across the water. I throttled back, letting the skiff glide silently through the channel as I used my high-powered thermal binoculars to scan the tree lines for any heat signatures that might belong to Silas. I saw the usual hotspots: sleeping, wading birds, raccoons, and the massive, elongated heat signatures of alligators floating just below the surface. As I lowered the binoculars to wipe the sweat from my eyes, I noticed something strange in the water directly behind my skiff. It was a wake. Now, when you pilot boats for a living, you learn how to read water. You can tell what kind of vessel or animal is moving beneath the surface based on the shape, speed, and displacement of the ripples they leave behind. An alligator swimming leaves a distinct undulating V-shape. A fish darting leaves a chaotic splashing trail. A man swimming leaves a clumsy, churning wake. The wake trailing about 50 yards behind my skiff was none of these things. It was massive. It was displacing an incredible amount of water, sending rolling waves crashing against the sawgrass on either side of the channel. But what made my blood run instantly cold was the shape of it. It wasn't the horizontal, undulating movement of a swimming reptile. It was a rhythmic, surging push and pull. It was a bipedal wake. Something incredibly large and incredibly heavy was walking upright through the waist-deep muck, following directly in my path. And it was moving fast, faster than any human could possibly trudge through that thick, sucking mud. I quickly grabbed my radio. Dispatch, this is Reeves. I have an unidentified object or entity tracking my vessel in Sector 4, requesting immediate backup. All I got in response was static. The heavy, oppressive humidity seemed to be killing the radio signals. I was completely alone. I looked back again. The wake was closing the distance. 40 yards, 30 yards. I could hear the sound of it now. Shh, thump, shh, thump. It was the sound of massive, heavy legs pushing through the water, tearing the roots of the sawgrass from the mud with every stride. The sheer physical power required to move like that through the swamp was terrifying. I threw the mud motor into full throttle. The engine screamed as the propeller bit into the water, shooting the skiff forward. I kept my eyes locked forward, expertly navigating the twists and turns of the channel, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. But no matter how fast I went, the bipedal wake kept pace. Every time I glanced back, those massive, surging waves were right there, maintaining a distance of about 20 yards. Then, the channel abruptly ended, opening up into a vast, shallow lagoon dotted with tiny, mangrove-covered islands. I shot out into the open water, the moonlight fully illuminating the area. I spun the skiff around in a sharp arc, killing the engine, and grabbed my high-powered spotlight. If this thing was going to follow me into the open, I was going to see what it was. I clicked on the spotlight, the brilliant white beam cutting through the humid darkness, and aimed it directly at the mouth of the channel I had just exited. The water was violently churning. The sawgrass at the edge of the channel was being pushed aside, flattened by something massive emerging into the lagoon. I held my breath, my finger trembling on the trigger of my flare gun, the only weapon I had on board. The wake surged forward into the open water, heading straight for my drifting skiff. But there was nothing above the surface. The water was only 3 feet deep, clear enough in the spotlight beam to see the muddy bottom. I could see the massive waves forming. I could see the water displacing violently in a bipedal walking pattern. But the entity causing it was completely invisible. There was no physical form breaking the surface. No head, no shoulders, nothing. Just a colossal, invisible force striding through the water with terrifying, predatory intent. Panic, absolute and unfiltered, took over. I dropped the spotlight, scrambled to the motor, and cranked it hard. The engine roared, and I blasted across the lagoon, not caring about the shallow reefs or the hidden logs. I drove blindly for nearly an hour until I reached the lights of the highway outpost. We never found Silas Davis. However, on August 5th, 2025, a different rescue team found his stilt house. The heavy wooden door had been completely ripped off its reinforced steel hinges. And leading away from his front porch, heading straight into the deepest, most impassable part of the Everglades, was a trail of flattened sawgrass. The path was nearly 6 feet wide, pressed completely flat into the mud, as if a bulldozer had driven through the swamp. Whatever walked out of there that night was massive. It walked on 2 legs, and it was entirely unseen. I still have nightmares about the sound of those heavy, invisible footsteps dragging through the midnight peat, getting closer and closer and closer. Story 3, Mark Davis. I am Mark Davis. I am a master tracker and a senior search and rescue coordinator for the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. My jurisdiction includes the Okefenokee Swamp. The locals call it the land of the trembling earth because the peat bogs are so unstable that stomping your foot can cause the trees around you to shake. It is a prehistoric place, deeply mysterious, and largely untouched by modern civilization. It is a place that does not tolerate mistakes, and it certainly does not welcome intruders. On September 21st, 2025, I was assigned to lead a search party for a group of 3 teenage boys, Tommy, Jake, and Leo. They had taken a pair of canoes into the deep interior of the swamp for a weekend camping trip and had failed to check in at the designated ranger station. We established a base camp on the perimeter, and I took a small, motorized flat-bottom boat deep into the heart of the Okefenokee, accompanied by my tracking dog, a seasoned bloodhound named Duke. Duke was fearless. He had cornered wild boars and tracked escaped convicts through the worst terrain imaginable. By the afternoon of September 22nd, 2025, we were miles away from any established water trails, pushing through dense thickets of buttonbush and navigating around massive, ancient cypress trees dripping with gray, ghostly Spanish moss. The heat was utterly staggering. The air was so thick and humid it felt like inhaling hot soup. The isolation was absolute. Our radios had lost all signal hours ago, leaving us completely cut off from the outside world. Around 4 o'clock, things started to feel profoundly wrong. It started with Duke. My brave, fearless tracking dog suddenly began to whine. He retreated to the very front of the boat, tucked his tail firmly between his legs, and began violently shivering. He wouldn't look at the water, and he wouldn't look at the tree line. He just stared at the aluminum floorboards, letting out these low, pathetic whimpers. I cut the engine and let the boat drift into a patch of stagnant green duckweed. I grabbed my rifle and scanned the surroundings, expecting to see a territorial bull alligator or perhaps a black bear on the banks. But the swamp was entirely devoid of wildlife. In fact, it was too quiet. The deafening chorus of cicadas had abruptly ceased. The birds were gone. Not a single turtle was sunning itself on the logs. The entire ecosystem had fallen into a dead, unnatural silence. It was the kind of suffocating isolation that presses against your eardrums, making you acutely aware of the blood rushing in your own veins. Then, I noticed the water. The Okefenokee does not have tides. It is a stagnant, slow-moving blackwater swamp. But as I sat there in the silence, I watched the water level against the trunk of a nearby cypress tree slowly begin to rise. It crept up the bark by about 6 inches, held there for a moment, and then slowly receded back to its original level. A few seconds later, it happened again. The water rose smoothly, silently, and then fell. It was rhythmic. It was consistent. I stared in absolute disbelief, my mind struggling to process the physics of what I was witnessing. It didn't look like a wave or a current. It looked exactly like the slow, deliberate expansion and contraction of a massive submerged chest. The marsh was breathing. A cold sweat broke out across my entire body despite the sweltering heat. I felt a sudden, crushing sense of vertigo, as if the world had suddenly tilted on its axis. The very environment around me felt distinctly alive, conscious, and deeply malevolent. I felt an overwhelming sensation of being watched not by an animal, but by the swamp itself. Suddenly, a sound shattered the silence. It came from deep within a dense, impenetrable wall of sawgrass to my left. Help us. It was a voice. It sounded like a young boy, perhaps Tommy or Jake, but it didn't sound right. The cadence was flat, devoid of true human emotion, and it carried a strange, wet, echoing resonance, as if it was being spoken through a tube filled with mud. We are over here. Duke let out a terrified yelp and scrambled under the bench seat of the boat, burying his head under his paws. My training kicked in, fighting against the primal terror rising in my chest. I grabbed my push-pole and began moving the boat toward the wall of sawgrass where the voice had originated. Tommy? Jake? Is that you? It's search and rescue. We're coming, I yelled, my voice sounding weak and swallowed by the dense vegetation. As I approached the 10-foot-tall wall of grass, something impossible happened. The sawgrass didn't just rustle, it actively parted. The thick, fibrous stalks physically bent backward, snapping at their bases, creating a perfectly round, dark tunnel leading deep into the flooded interior of the island. There was no wind. No animal was pushing through it. The vegetation was simply moving out of the way, inviting me inside. Come, closer, Mark. The voice spoke my name. I had never announced my name to the boys, and I hadn't used it on the radio since yesterday. The voice was coming from deep inside that dark, unnatural tunnel in the grass. I stopped pulling. Every survival instinct forged over 20 years of tracking screamed at me to turn around. I looked down into the black water beneath my boat. The water was still rising and falling in that rhythmic, terrifying breathing pattern. The entire swamp was a living, breathing entity, and it was setting a trap. I didn't enter the tunnel. I shoved the pole into the mud, reversing the boat with frantic, desperate thrusts. I yanked the pole cord on the motor, praying to God it would start. It sputtered to life, and I jammed the throttle forward, spinning the boat around and tearing back the way I came, leaving the breathing marsh and that flat, wet voice behind. The official report states that the 3 boys drowned after their canoes capsized. We eventually found their overturned boats a week later, on September 29th, 2025. But we never found their bodies. I retired from the department a month later. I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. The swamp is not just a place. In its deepest, darkest heart, it is a predator. And it uses the voices of its victims to lure in new prey. Story 4, David Archer. My name is David Archer. I am a specialized dive master and water rescue technician operating in East Texas. My area of expertise is Caddo Lake, a sprawling, maze-like bayou that straddles the Texas-Louisiana border. It is a hauntingly beautiful place, dominated by massive, ancient, bald cypress trees, draped in thick curtains of Spanish moss. The lake is essentially a flooded forest, full of hidden sloughs, blind channels, and deep, dark holes where the sun never reaches. On October 30th, 2025, the nightmare became personal. I wasn't searching for a lost tourist or a drunken fisherman. I was searching for one of my own. Officer Thomas "Tommy" Ridge was a veteran Marine patrolman and a close personal friend. He had vanished a week prior while on a routine night patrol in a notorious section of the lake known as the Boneyard. It's an area choked with the petrified, jagged stumps of long-dead cypress trees sticking out of the water like rotting teeth. It is treacherous to navigate, even in broad daylight. The official search had been scaled back to a recovery operation, but I refused to give up. On the night of October 30th, 2025, the eve of Halloween, I took my own personal John boat out into the lake. I was off duty, operating entirely on my own, driven by a desperate need to find my friend. The weather was atrocious. A thick, soupy fog had rolled in just after sunset, cutting visibility down to less than 10 feet. The humidity was oppressive, carrying the distinct, putrid smell of stagnant rot, dead fish, and something uniquely metallic, like old copper coins. I navigated almost entirely by GPS and the slow, sweeping beam of my tactical flashlight, weaving slowly through the skeletal remains of the boneyard. Around 2 in the morning, the beam of my light caught something reflective hanging from the branches of a massive cypress tree about 20 yards ahead. I cut the engine and used a paddle to silently close the distance, the water parting like dark oil around the bow of my boat. As I got closer, the metallic smell grew incredibly strong, making my stomach churn. I aimed the light up into the draped Spanish moss. My blood ran cold. Hanging from the thick, gnarled branches, suspended about 10 feet above the black water, was Tommy's tactical vest. It was perfectly intact, fully zipped, and carefully draped over the branch. Beside it hung his heavy-duty utility belt, complete with his radio, his flashlight, and his holstered sidearm. They weren't snagged or caught in the tree as if thrown in a struggle. They were meticulously, deliberately placed there, like clothes hung in a closet. "Tommy?" I called out, my voice trembling, the sound immediately swallowed by the thick, unnatural fog. Suddenly, my own radio, clipped to my shoulder, hissed with static. I jumped, startled by the sudden noise. The static cleared, replaced by the sound of heavy, labored breathing. "David." It was Tommy's voice. It was coming through my radio, but it sounded incredibly close, as if he were whispering directly into the microphone. I frantically grabbed my radio, pressing the transmit button. "Tommy, where are you? I'm at the cypress in the boneyard. I see your gear. Talk to me, buddy. Where are you?" The radio hissed again. "Look down, David." The voice didn't come from the radio this time. It came from the water, directly beneath my boat. I slowly leaned over the edge of the aluminum gunnel, aiming my flashlight straight down into the murky depths. The water here was deep, maybe 20 feet. The beam cut through the tannin-stained water, illuminating the swirling sediment and the submerged, rotting roots of the cypress trees. At first, I saw nothing. But then, deep in the darkness, something pale began to rise toward the surface. It was a face. It was Tommy's face. But it was grotesque, distended, and horrifyingly wrong. His eyes were wide open, glowing with a faint, sickly luminescence in the dark water. His mouth was stretched open in an impossibly wide, silent scream, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth that did not belong in a human skull. As the face drifted closer to the surface, I realized with a surge of absolute terror that it wasn't attached to a body. It was attached to a thick, pale, fleshy stalk, like a deep-sea anglerfish's lure, extending downward into the impenetrable blackness where a massive, shadowy form shifted on the lake bed. The face bumped gently against the bottom of my boat. The radio on my shoulder crackled to life one last time. the voice dripping with malevolent, hungry glee. Join us, David. The rot is so warm. The massive, shadowy form beneath the water suddenly surged upward. The water around my boat violently erupted. Long, pale, multi-jointed limbs broke the surface, attempting to grab the sides of the John boat. I threw myself backward, slamming into the outboard motor. I didn't bother pulling the cord. I hit the electronic starter. The engine screamed, the prop churning the water into a bloody froth. The sudden thrust threw the creature off balance, and the boat shot forward, tearing through the fog and the petrified stumps. I drove recklessly, the hull of the boat slamming against submerged logs, nearly throwing me into the water half a dozen times, until I finally reached the safety of the main channel and the distant lights of the marina. I never went back to Caddo Lake. The official report stated that Officer Thomas Ridge was presumed drowned, his body lost to the deep currents of the bayou. They never found his gear in the tree. I never told anyone what I saw beneath the water that night. They wouldn't believe me anyway. They would say it was swamp gas, or a hallucination brought on by grief and exhaustion. But I know the truth. I know that the humid, stagnant rot of the swamp breeds things older and more terrifying than we can comprehend. And I know that in the deepest parts of those black waters, the missing aren't just lost. They are absorbed. They become part of the whispering rot. Well, riders of the night, it seems the stagnant waters and deep bayous hold far more than just gators and sunken logs. Some things out in the dark are ancient, hungry, and waiting just beneath the surface. I'm your host, Midnight Rider, and I want to thank you for braving the shadows with me tonight here on Scary Hours of Darkness. If these search and rescue nightmares made your blood run cold, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below. Let me know which of these swamp encounters terrified you the most. Your support is what keeps this channel alive. Do you have a terrifying tale of your own? If you've survived a creepy encounter, witnessed something unexplainable, or have a true story that needs to be told, send it to me at mycreepyencounter@gmail.com. I'd love to feature your experience in an upcoming video. Until next time, keep your lights on, avoid the deep water, and as always, stay safe out there.